Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, co-host of the show, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors, joining us. Kevin, great to see you.
Good to see you too, Tim.
And Kevin, I know you and your team are just off this whirlwind tour of the state county offices of ed, giving the updates on the governor's budget. No, that's wonderful. I learned a lot myself from the update, so thank you for doing that. Now, the legislature's had a chance to respond to the governor's proposals, and there's been some pretty big differences. Notably, I think the base funding is one, right? So maybe start off with
Sure.
just some of the high level differences, and particularly the base funding, please.
You bet. So, I mean, what's important is, and we said this when we were out doing our budget workshops. So here we have the very last workshops just yesterday. And we said, we know that the legislature, the assembly and the Senate normally will go through a process where they each have their views about issues and they sort them all out together in what's called a two-house conference committee, which has been in operation my entire career until last year. And last year, I think the legislature thought that by getting together earlier, sort of mapping out what their differences were and resolving them, would strengthen their position in going into the negotiation with the governor. So last year they bypassed that conference committee altogether. But this year they did it again, and they did it last night. They announced it last night. In fact, it was pretty late last night. We got this information. We just sent out to all of our clients statewide a little summary of what the legislature is doing that's different. There's some things in there that are great, but there's a lot of things in there, frankly, that are a little bit disconcerting. So what we're hoping is a combination of things, a major advocacy push, because we're going to get LEAs to write about the couple issues I'm going to talk about. You need to talk to your legislators and put some pressure on them that this is a big deal on the areas where there are differences. And then the other issue is the hope that the governor comes out of this very strong and says, no, I got to have some of these things that the K-12 community has asked for. So we start first with the base, which is great news. Many people heard me use the sort of phrase that I wanted there to be a contest at the Capitol of who loves us the most relative to base funding. And my optimism was that the governor had the smallest base increase amongst the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor, and that at $2.1 billion, which he was proposing to add to the 6.56% COLA, we could do better than that. And so with the legislature, the Assembly, and the Senate had a proposal that, gosh, the total dollars ended up being close to 15, or I'm sorry, it was close to 14%. The Assembly had a 15% when you added up the different dimensions to it. Well, they worked together to come up with the math that they suggest is a 16% COLA. But what they do is they plot $4.5 billion on top of the 6.56% COLA to get you to that place. But you got to remember, and we just talked about this during our budget workshops that we just did all over the state, that there are a bunch of little sort of building blocks to how the LCFF gets adjusted that way. And so one of the major issues that we've got to tackle is this issue of ADA and the current year problems that we're having, along with the 3-year rolling average. And we were pretty unhappy about the fact that this two-house agreement leaves out the current year fix, which we need to have. The 3-year rolling average really isn't as effective as it could be. And it'll have implications over multiple years for a lot of districts if we don't get added to it the current year fix. And we know that the budget chair in the Assembly, Phil Ting, doesn't really like it very much. And so we're going to have to really emphasize to all of our legislators that the current year fix to ADA has to be added to the 3-year rolling average. We've got to have that. So that's one of the major pushes that we're going to have. And I'll talk about some of the others a little bit later. The other thing that happened that needed to happen, but it kind of was lost in a lot of the budget talk of the last several weeks, was something that was embedded in a bill, but we didn't see it in the budget talks, which is that we have to have a substitute for free and reduced meals being kind of the trigger on supplemental and concentration grants as for an unduplicated kid. So they do change that in their package. They have it be 250% of poverty. The good news on that is it actually raises the number of kids that get covered by that. So districts with low counts of kids in the free and reduced program are now going to stand a chance of actually having a larger number of kids counted as being in poverty, and it's a legitimate index. So the real question is, how do we gather that information? Because we're going to have to obviously do parent surveys or get data to substantiate the number of kids that we're going to be able to count as unduplicated. So those are some of the top line kind of issues. And I know you got your list, Tim, of things you wanted me to try to cover here too.
Yeah, no worries. So thank you, Kevin. I mean, this ADA thing has been a major issue since, this declining enrollment trend was noticed. And I guess it feels good that we're this deep into the weeds trying to solve it. And regardless, hopefully we'll have a positive outcome, and more positive perhaps than the governor proposed, as you mentioned. So that's great news. Also, the fact that the base could be increased over the increase that we received sounds wonderful, especially with all the buttons and the campaigns we were running before this. So great news there. Can you tell us about block grants? The government had proposed a block grant. What's the legislature's version of that?
Yeah, so there were all kinds of block grants floating around too, ideas. And again, the governor's was the lowest of the different block grant proposals that were there. So the legislature now comes in and said, instead of the governor's $8 billion block grant, which had a lot of flexibility to it, they have an $8.5 billion block grant. So they added $500 million. But man, do they tie this down. The governor's objective had 3 general areas they wanted you to spend money on, and then kind of anything else you wanted. In the legislature's package, it's very, very restricted. And in fact, the language talks about using the dollars almost entirely for compensation type issues, staffing, personnel costs. And then it does mention pension costs. So that's just throwing a bone to us that we've got some relief on CalSTRS and PERS. The problem is, and this is a lot of money, no question about it, is that it uses Prop 98 dollars to solve this, when in the past, 2 governors have used general fund money to solve this problem rather than our own money. We like to make sure that Prop 98 dollars are spent exclusively for teaching and learning, not for bailing out the statewide pension systems. And so there's a little difference there. Now the governor proposed doing kind of the same thing. So I think the likelihood we're going to see them reverse course on this is almost 0. So if you had to pick now ways of getting this addressed in some ways, the fact that they say staffing and all this other stuff and pension, the pension thing is going to use up a good chunk of that money. So you'll have some short-term relief, but it'll just be for a year. And then we're going to have to stay on this issue again next year. But that's what's going on with regard to the block grant. Very restrictive. We wish it wasn't that restrictive, but they do double down on the idea of pensions. That is in alignment with the governor using Prop 98 dollars for that. So yeah, it's a bit of a problem.
Sounds like the governor had been sort of hinting around at how you could address pensions, and this is more of a prescriptive. This is what you should do.
Yeah.
So good, good that they raised it, but tougher restrictions. And thanks for the update there.
Yeah.
And of course, everyone will be keeping you updated on the show. Excuse me. So last episode we talked about ELOP and the proposal there. Can you tell us about the changes with the legislature?
Yeah. So one of the things they do is they rename the program, and I'm looking for it here. It's got it's early education and ELOP kind of packaged together a little bit, but they give the governor basically the same amount of money, and then but they have a 2-tiered approach. You guys might remember that in the May revision, the governor goes to basically $2,500 per kid, and everybody gets that amount. But there were a lot of districts, because of course they had to put together their plans for the summer and going into this year, what they were going to do relative to expanded learning opportunities. And they've done negotiations with their own employee groups. And they were using roughly a $2,000 figure as their sort of test. Well, what the legislature does is come back in and restores the idea that it'll actually be differing amounts depending on the supplemental grant kids that you have. And if you're over 75%, you get a bigger dollar amount. So the bigger dollar amount's $3,000. So it's an even bigger amount of money. But then they take the line for all other kids in poverty, if you're not in concentrations, high concentration of poverty, and they drop that back down to 1,500. That's a problem for the districts that just got done negotiating something for 2,000, when the governor's made revision said 2,500 for all kids in poverty. So we're going to have to make sure we raise this point to Department of Finance and others, so that when the governor gets together in meetings, they say, hey, thank you, legislature, for wanting to have a differentiation, whatever, but you're actually shortchanging districts that are trying to do the right thing, because they were not planning for a dollar amount as low as 1,500 on the supplemental grant kids that they have that they're trying to serve. The other issue is, and you guys have heard me say this before, about we don't want them to be hung with a moniker they love some poor kids more than others, is that supplemental grant kids or kids in poverty in big concentrations of poverty are all poor kids. And I think where the governor was headed to set it at 2,500 for all kids made good policy sense. So for the legislature to go return to a two-tiered system and then have the dollar amount, at least on the low end, not at least match what we were contemplating we might get, is a problem. So we got to get that fixed. So it's their response to the governor's budget. And in some ways, you've got some problems here that we got to try to address.
Well, thanks for sharing those big differences. And there's actually quite a few other differences that we'll get to in a moment. I did want to take a minute and actually jump into one of the tech issues that's happening right now. Anybody who's watched this show for a long time knows that we've been talking about cybersecurity as a regular topic on this show in all varieties, but particularly about the lack of funding in K-12 education for cybersecurity. And one of the largest opportunities, we've had John Harrington, CEO of Funds for Learning, the largest E-rate consultant in the US. He's been on talking about the need for the FCC and E-rate to support schools with funding to help them overcome these cybersecurity challenges. There's really been no talk until the last week or so. The US Senate actually, I believe it's Patty Murray, the US Senator from Washington, was advocating for the FCC and E-rate to help support schools with cybersecurity funding, right? Stuff like software that you might need, firewall experts that you might need. And remember, the majority of school districts in the US are under 3,000 kids. They don't have this massive team that's going to be able to tackle this stuff. So there's a lot of support that districts need to overcome this big issue that's hurting a lot of districts right now. And it's interesting to look at the FCC because, the headlines that they're putting out lately is Rosenworcel, who's the commissioner, is asking for Wi-Fi on buses. When you look at people's burning list of needs, it's not that that's not a noble gesture, but the cybersecurity crisis that we're in, let's just say that's where we are with education, needs to be addressed. And there's no word from the FCC on this right now. Also, I want to point out, we've covered this story before. Biden, when Biden comes in, we're expecting the FCC to have a Democratic majority. They're still split 2-2. There's been a lot of let's just say, I don't know if we call it filibustering or heel dragging about getting that third Democrat in and getting that majority at the FCC. So the FCC's hands have been kind of tied, but the fact that they're out in the media talking about Wi-Fi on buses when cybersecurity is such a big issue, that's a little disconcerting. And again, when you're advocating for things that you need help with and support with, that is a tool, a vehicle that can be of assistance. And you've got senators asking for it now. And one of my favorite things from this debate was cybersecurity experts said, offering a network, which E-rate does, it helps you build your Wi-Fi network without cybersecurity is like building a race car without seatbelts or airbags. I mean, why even make it? So I love that. I love that quote. And Kevin, when we were talking, you were talking about how particularly interesting it was that it was, Patty Murray because of her position in the Senate. Can you just talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it is really significant. She's very powerful. She's really important to us in the education community because she chairs the full Education and Labor Committee in the U.S. Senate. So for her to be pointing in this direction is very, very significant. It's great to have her support on this issue.
Well, thanks, Kevin. We'll have a couple articles in there as well, just to give you a little more detail on what was going on in the Senate, and an article from John Harrington at Funds for Learning, just kind of talking about the Wi-Fi on the buses versus the cybersecurity. But Kevin, I know people are eager to hear more about the differences between the governor's proposal and the legislature. That's on everyone's mind because guess what? July's right around the corner. and we're going to have to enact these new budgets and start the next budget year. So let's see, let's talk about the transportation to get started. I know that was a big issue, you know, the buses and so on, but help us understand the difference with what the legislature's proposed there.
Yeah, the governor had his $1.5 billion proposal for electric buses. And a lot of people in the education community were not wild about that proposal for a variety of reasons. One is that it spends Prop 98 money again on infrastructure related costs that should be a general fund cost. So we didn't like that. I mean, it is one-time money, but you know, we were talking about, we need school bus drivers. We need way more than we need those electric buses. And so, and we've talked about that during our budget workshops. But what the legislature decides to do, the Assembly and the Senate, is move closer toward the idea of a universal school transportation system that provides adequate transportation resources to all LEAs with a $1.2 billion infusion of money. And we shouldn't be too surprised that the legislature's version would have that, given that the chair of the budget committee in the state Senate, Nancy Skinner, is also the author of the bill that would say we got to get closer to universal, you know, transportation for all kids. The one sort of disconcerting part of it is that we're not so sure that some of the mandates and requirements, like getting rid of current fee structures and those sort of things that school districts have, that this program ends up being fully paid for. And it's got to be paid for. School transportation is very expensive undertaking. We love the fact that we want to get school transportation dollars out to all LEAs across the state. That's important, but it's got to be properly funded. But anyways, it makes a very big splash in the legislature's proposal by being up there, $1.2 billion of ongoing money. And then of course, they keep the $1.5 billion of one-time money the governor had for those electric buses stays in the proposal. And I'm sure that is a little bone to throw the governor that they didn't get rid of that proposal. So yeah, transportation.
Thanks, Kevin. How about school nutrition? There's a difference there. Please talk about that.
Yeah, a little bit on school nutrition. The legislature is really committed to this issue. So in addition to, they basically approve what the governor's put in, but they also put in a few other little items on there, which is allowing like a mid-year settle up for meal funding to cover actual costs. Sometimes they've been known to run out of money in the state, and they basically say, we've run out of money, tough luck. They don't want that to be the case going forward, and they're really embracing the idea of universal meal program. There are other nuances to what the legislature is doing here, but I don't want to get people too much in the weeds on this, because once they get done with the negotiations with the governor, a lot of this is going to change a little bit. But on the school nutrition stuff, just suffice it to say that they're ahead of the governor a little bit on some of the things they would do for school nutrition, including the idea of funds for kitchen facilities and training, employee training.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the update there. And again, everyone, if you tune in regularly, you'll get more updates on this. So, you know, please tune in. We'll keep you posted there. How about community schools and special ed? Those two, we can talk about that, please.
Well, in community schools is real interesting. This is a major one of those signature initiatives by the governor. You know, he got that funded in last year's budget. He has it again in this year's budget. And the legislature zeroes it out completely. So we're going to see what happens in that. And I think that's going to be real important to the governor. So look for that to potentially come back. We'll see what happens. The governor wanted $1.5 billion of additional funds into community schools in his budget. Notice that number, $1.5 billion of one-time money, seems to match the $1.5 billion on electric school buses. I don't know if they're hoping the governor will sort of see the wisdom that he wants his community schools, he has to jettison the buses. Who knows? But the reason why he wants those buses to be part of this package, by the way, I'll just mention, we talked a lot in our budget workshops about the GAN limit, and that the state has a limit on how much it can actually spend. But there are exceptions to the GAN limit that keep them under triggering the consequences of hitting that GAN limit, which is to return a bunch of money to taxpayers. In order to avoid hitting the GAN limit, one of the areas you can spend money on is in infrastructure. And so the governor has the $1.5 billion for electric buses embedded in Prop 98, but it actually helps him on the infrastructure issue with regard to the GAN limit. And so he's going to want that to still be in this, I imagine. So it's a tough choice there, probably for the governor, but it is interesting. Community schools are very important to him. I see that in final negotiations coming back into play. So we'll see what happens with that.
Thanks.
Oh, and
And I
then on
know,
special ed,
yeah, please.
you mentioned, and on special ed, it's just to know that the legislature does in fact go along with that same dollar amount that the governor was proposing, a $500 million increase in special ed for base rate increases. We still have the question though about how you apply the COLA, the 6.56% COLA doesn't seem to be reflected in what they've published as the base rate change, which would go at, it's currently pegged at $820 was in the governor's budget, but because the COLA changed from 5.33 to 6.56, we were expecting that base rate number to go up, and we don't see it either in this proposal. We don't see it in the governor's. They keep using the 820 figure. We think that number needs to be at least 830 or maybe even higher. So we'll see what happens with that. I imagine it just get adjusted for sure if we end up getting the money. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for the update there. And then I know this has been a really painful topic for a lot of people. School facilities, there's been statewide bonds that have come and gone. There's, lots of talk, but there's a massive need out there. And I know there are a lot of people who are eager to get some sort of relief here. So can you talk about that, please?
Yeah. So this is one of those issues where the legislature had thought, or rather the governor and the legislature both are on the same page with regard to this and said, look, we've got a GAM limit problem. Anything we spend on infrastructure helps us avoid it. Let's spend a crazy amount of money on school facilities. So Phil Ting, the budget chairman in the assembly, had said, I want us to be spending like $10 billion is what his proposal was. And this is months ago. You get through this negotiation, the governor had $4 billion in mind over a multiple year period of what you would amass prior year, current year, next year, $4 billion that you would spend on school facilities. And the idea would be that you would basically address the needs of everybody that's currently in line. It doesn't do much to help, for the unmet need of people that are going to be applying, but it does, at least in their estimate, take care of a lot of the people that are in line. And the governor mentioned it as bridge funding to when we do pass a bond, with the idea of maybe a bond in 2024. So they're all on the same page. Why go to November when we don't know what, with inflation doing what it's doing, with consumer prices all over the place going up, the mood of the electorate to raise, taxes generally for purposes of a bond measure, you could see there would be some more reluctance there. So going this route makes sense. The legislature adds $1 billion to the governor's proposal. So then you'd have some capacity to get a little bit further beyond the current sort of line, if you will, of people that have demand for modernization and new construction. So we welcome that. We think that's a really smart idea. $5 billion. So that is in the legislature's budget on facilities.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that update. And we'll look for more on future episodes here. I want to just talk about something that's been out there for just a bit now, and that is that Calpads, the statewide data system, there was let's just say an unfortunate timing issue on a major update that actually impacted and is impacting a lot of the testing that's happened and the data collection that goes with that. And you're probably very familiar with this, in your districts. Actually, Edgar Zalzetta, the executive director of AXA, Vernon Billy, executive director of CSBA, both wrote letters to the state saying, hey, this is not something that we can tolerate. If you need us to collect data and report it to you, and you kind of break the system that we are using to collect the data, we're all in big trouble. And that's because so many schools have been reaching out, letting folks know that this has been such a challenge for them. And I guess, from the tech world, tech needs upgrades. We get it, right? You got a big system, you got some infrastructure, it gets old, it gets long in the tooth, and you need to refresh it. Well, I mean, best practices in tech is you do that in off time, right? In a school, you might upgrade your network in the summer while everybody's gone. You fiddle with it, you fix the bugs, and everybody comes back and hopefully it's running smoothly. So the fact that they chose to do this big update in April is concerning. It's certainly surprising, and it really hurt a lot of districts this year and causing a lot of trouble for folks with data collection. And goodness gracious, we already have enough issues with, our kids there. How do we reach them? Are they at home? So this was an unwelcome change. I know, Kevin, you gave people some heads up about this, but just love to hear some of the
Yeah,
things
we
that you
did.
were trying to tell people.
I'll to give some credit to Gina Potter, who's down in the San Ysidro School District Superintendent, who alerted me really early to this issue and said, hey, we got a problem with this. We immediately turned around and made sure we were communicating with the state superintendent and the chief deputy state superintendent, Mary Nicely, and said, just a heads up, I think this could be a major problem. And then it ended up being this just major issue, which the department's been scrambling on to try to now address and mitigate. And subsequent to that, a bunch of the leadership at CDE have been responding to the field about kind of what the game plan is to try to get this, right-sided up. So that's underway right now. But Vernon and Edgar both did send communications subsequent to my my little early alert, if you will, and so the CDE gets it completely. They know there's a major problem out there because all the statewides are on it. I think CASBO has raised the issue now too. So a lot of folks have chimed in on this, and they got to get that right. It is not just important for us to have that metric right as we try to serve the interests of kids, identify kids that we need to be focused on, but also on the accountability side, the assessment system is an important accountability tool. Well, it drives a lot of the accountability sort of matrix that we use for school districts. It'll be totally unfair for school districts to get pounded on data that's just wrong. So we got to get that fixed.
And I just want to underscore something. If you're talking to someone about this not happening again, it's not rocket science. It's just don't do a major overhaul to a critical system in the most important time of the year, right? Do it during the holidays if you had to, or hopefully over the summer when there's less demand and, after the testing period. And whatever issues are there, it's okay. We know that they're there. You can give people guidance on how to handle that when they hit some of those challenges. That knowing the challenges you have and overcoming them is far better than being surprised with a whole list of new challenges. And I think that was really the issue. So with that, Kevin, I want to say thank you so much for your time today. I want to ask everybody who's watching this, if you get a chance, please help us share in social media. You are our advertising team. We have no marketing budget for this. We try to do this to support you. We love the fact that you watch the show. Thank you for the kind messages that come our way. We're glad this offers us support, and we'll be back with some more tips and news on what's going on with that the governor's versus the legislature's package and what's going to hit in July soon. So thanks everybody for watching, and Kevin, we'll talk to you soon.
It's great to be on again. Thanks so much, Tim.
All right.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.